Welcome to the Restoration Activation Project video commentary series. Hi, I'm Mary Ann. I'm glad you could join me. In the last video, I was digging a little more deeply into the balancing process, this innate, ongoing process that's constantly unfolding throughout the whole of consciousness, and how that relates to the conscious journey of awakening and how you can use that and begin working with that to progress on your journey. Okay? In the last commentary, I mentioned a few of the different references to the two fundamental characteristics or types of consciousness within the whole of consciousness. Okay? The two characteristics that, because they're oppositional, they enable creation. The friction between them enables creation. Without the two, creation wouldn't be possible. Consciousness would not exist. We would not be. Excuse me. Pardon me. Lots of chemtrails today. Anyway, so some of the references to these two forces, if you will, light and dark, good and evil, right and wrong, left and right, some of those who've done a lot of research. Anyway, which the terms which imply, or positive, negative, that's another one. And sometimes we are backed into communication corners where some of these terms do get used, but if they are your underlying perspective, if they are the lenses through which you actually view these two forces, then that can be a problem. It could be, you could already be working through a distortion or creating one. Because to believe, remember, beliefs themselves are distortions. They're false beliefs. This is why I choose not to believe anything, because I choose to operate from a place of inner knowing and not believe anything, but make my own choices of words and language that, to the best of my ability, detach me from, or keep me detached from, various ideologies and dogmas and concepts and notions. No attachments. Because that's part of the process of self-mastery and awakening, is having absolutely no attachments to any aspect of this reality and the goings on. No attachments. And I'll probably do a commentary specifically around attachments at some point, but that's the underlying, part of the underlying work, to have no attachments to. And so one of the ways that I personally choose to reduce my number of attachments and make clean breaks is to choose certain types of words to describe things, which is why I use consciousness progressive and consciousness regressive over some of the other terms that I just mentioned. Because from my perspective, those terms are terms of judgment, of rating and ranking, in that sense. Not discernment. Discernment's good, but to judge by categorizing or classifying or rating and ranking. I mean, light and dark. I mean, when we hear those words, we think of one as being good and one being bad. Those are distortions. Good and evil, certainly. One type of consciousness is better than the other. So, and in doing that, we create bottlenecks and blockages. We add to the distortions within ourselves, or we're operating through a distortion. And by seeing these forces as, excuse me, as one being lesser or greater or better or worse than the other, we keep ourselves from ourselves. We create bottlenecks and blockages that prevent our fullest capacity to transduce core self and to access inner knowings. Pardon me, sip of tea. Okay. And when we do that, when we operate through distortions, we're limiting ourselves and our capacities and a higher order knowledge that can come to us, because they're limiting beliefs, and limiting beliefs lead us to fear-based responses. Because we're either operating, when we're operating through consciousness, progressive consciousness, we're operating through real love. When we're operating through consciousness, regressive consciousness, our choice of thoughts, actions, and behaviors are fear-based. This is what distortions do to us. This is how they limit us. They keep us functioning through fear-based thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. And then that's what we create, because those are our tools of creation. Okay? So, which is one of the primary reasons I want to talk, and I'm always speaking to this balancing process. Not just because understanding it expands our awareness of what's really going on, and thus how to best perform or to fulfill our missions here, but to eliminate distortions, minimize fear around consciousness, regressive consciousness. In other words, if we are on occasion being interfered with by some external force, either its presence or it's functioning through us or through someone that we're interacting with, then when we really come to deeply understand that this is just part of the balancing process, this is just the way it works, then although the incident might be specific to you or me, it isn't personal. This is just the way things work, even when it seems personal. And the interferer might use things about you that are very personal to you. It's just performing a role, either consciously or not. But it's fulfilling a purpose, its role in that moment or at that point in this reality at this time, because it may or may not even be, you can't, to see things as black or white is to miss the bigger picture. Getting back to the principles of creation, the principle of polarity. The vast, vast majority of conscious entities, and I mean those that actually have consciousness and vital energy coursing through them, because there are a lot of beings on this planet in our world at this time, or off planet functioning in our world, that are not, that they're not consciousness, vital energy infused. Some people call them soulless, or maybe more like androids or whatever, but there are beings out there that are not comprised of consciousness. And even they serve a balancing process purpose. They're part of it too. Even when there isn't any consciousness, there isn't a core self flowing, or that they were originally connected to. Now, there are entities who have either, if not created some of these beings, but they function through them, they use them. So there is no aspect, no expression within consciousness, even if that expression is not of consciousness and vital energy, that isn't playing a role in the balancing process. And the balancing process just is. It just is. And when you really start taking that in, you are empowered. You can begin to start letting go, if not instantly, to start gradually releasing your fears around it, because your fears do nothing other than interfere, distortions, with your ability to fully connect with and transduce core self. It's like, okay, I had this really nasty dream last night. I know I was being messed with. But instead of being afraid, it's like, okay, this just means that I need to become master, learning how to master my dream state. And sometimes even after you just even before you've come to fully master that, for example, just for an example, but just the first step or two sometimes can make a huge difference, so that you're not being messed with in your dream state. Same thing with mastering any of your energies, including sexual energies. When you understand that when you are not master of that energy, then that energy is master of you, that's an imbalance based on a distortion. It's like, okay, what's to be afraid of or upset by? This is just part of the deal. Now, if you're really struggling with some of this, then you're likely struggling with, to some degree, cognitive dissonance. And I'm in the process of writing an article about that and a couple of other issues that can interfere with our journey. But refusal to accept what is, to know what is and turn your back on it, exacerbates the problem. Whatever problem, whatever you would categorize as a problem, to turn your back on it or actively deny it. You know, you can either just pretend it's not there or you can actively deny it. Causes that problem to fester. Do you really want that? Probably not. If you're on the conscious journey, a conscious journey of awakening, never be afraid of knowledge. Ever. I don't care what it is or how nasty it might seem. You can choose to, once you've checked it out for yourself, and I mean by either research when that's possible, common sense, running it past all of your energy systems, running it through the mind, not just the mind center, but the heart center and the creational center, your inner knowing. To determine its truth or validity. But never be afraid of information in itself. Okay? So, the more you know, the more you have the capacity for empowerment. It's just a matter of whether or not you choose to take that understanding and apply it. Because even when you do come to a very deep knowing, an inner knowing, a deep understanding, an expanded understanding of the way things really are, what you really are, and how things work and interact and all that, the more you enable your opportunity, the more doors you open for yourself on this journey in terms of progressing. So, seeking higher order knowledge and then embodying it, acting on it, that's wisdom. Just knowing something and understanding something basically doesn't get you anywhere. Oh, it might be satisfying to the ego, but until you apply it, the application of higher order knowledge is wisdom. That is wisdom, to do that. Otherwise, what's the point? Just to satisfy ego? That's another distortion, because that's ego identification attachment. It makes you feel better about yourself just to know. Well, now, coming to knowledge and coming to understand can make you feel really good. I mean, I can't tell you how many times that throughout the course of this journey, as many times as I have been deeply disturbed as I moved through and gained more and more knowledge and understanding of what's really going on, there are times where I felt deeply disturbed. It was very unsettling to me. But I also felt great relief. It's like, wow, that when I understand more how things work, I can look back over the course of my life and go, okay, that's what was going on. Or it could have been this, but it's like, at least I have some more understanding as to why. So that I can now, from where I am right now, use that knowledge in my self-mastery awakening process and use it to advance my progress. And that's all higher order knowledge. That's the fundamental purpose of that. Whether you're on a consciousness progressive or a consciousness regressive journey, there are a lot of self-proclaimed consciousness regressive beings on this planet. They call themselves something else, but I don't want to get into those terms, that will tell you that it's part of their work to gain more higher order understandings of how things work so that they can use them to fulfill their consciousness regressive agendas. And there may be things that they discover that they don't like. I assure you there are. In the same way that we come across things that are very ugly or disturbing or unsettling to us, so do they. But they don't let it interfere. It's like, okay, I don't like it. We're going to find it. Maybe they're looking for workarounds. Whereas you or I may be looking for ways to fully embody this understanding so that we can consciously choose more consciousness progressive responses. But never fear knowledge, and don't be afraid of understandings, but be sure you apply them in your life. Embody them. Use them. That's what this knowledge is for. What else would knowledge be for? Just to satisfy ego? Just to make you feel better or more self-important? If that's primarily what it does for you, again, like I said, that's those are distortions. But in any case, that if not immediately, but over time, just accepting that this process is going on 24/7. It's perpetual throughout the whole of consciousness, within every aspect of consciousness, every version of core self, every reality, dimension, density, evolutionary cycle, and even those that are not inorganic, soulless beings are part of that process. Okay? Now, in this part 2 of this commentary that I'm participating in right now, I also want to get into how this process is played out by way of interventions and interference. Interventions being those signs and things that happen to us that are coming from consciousness progressive beings, and interference, those events and occurrences that are the result of consciousness regressive beings doing things, okay? And first I'm going to look at interventions. Most of the attention, or a lot of the attention that is given to external interference is usually focused, or in a lot of circles, the focus is on the consciousness regressive interference. And it's very beneficial if you're in a place of balance about it. If you're also spending just as much time looking into interventions and expanding your consciousness around that. And in doing that, you'll make yourself more aware of when they occur in your life, because they're just as frequent. They're just not usually there with a blaring horn. announcing that that's what this is, in the same way that interference shows up and usually gets our attention because it's playing on our fears. It's playing on our distortions, our self-limiting, fear-based false beliefs. And so it's amplifying that fear. And fear gets our attention, no doubt. Whereas interventions, sometimes they show up with a fanfare, but more often than not, they're far more subtle, because when they're truly, and not a false intervention, I'll talk about that a little bit, but when they're truly the action of a consciousness progressive, a higher density being, they're adhering to the principles of creation. They restrict themselves by and large to actions that do not interfere with the journey of the individual. The signs, the messages we get, whether in a dream or through a movie or something in nature, the ways that they're trying to speak to us and get our attention are usually far more subtle. But the more you focus on that, balancing that with your focus on the negative interference, negative consciousness regressive interference that may be occurring, the more likely you are to be able to tune in more to signs that are interventions. You're expanding your capacity to tune into those, because I can assure you that even if you're fairly tuned into that now, you can become even more aware and in tune and pick up on interventions that you weren't able to before. They were there, but you just weren't seeing, hearing, being able to actually be in a place where you can get them. All right? So spend just as much time and energy exploring interventions, looking back over the course of your own life to go, wow, there have been a lot. Or you could say, well, I don't think I've had very many, but now that I'm looking more into that, I can say, oh my gosh, I understand more now, and I can see that that was an intervention. That was an intervention. So that you're finding that balance between the two. And granted, we are currently in the throes of the last stages of a consciousness regressive evolutionary cycle. I would say now more than ever, be attuned to receiving interventions. The balancing act, the balancing process, because the predominant consciousness is consciousness regressive. There are lots of forces and entities besides you and me coming into this reality right now, along with all the consciousness regressive forces and entities that are coming into this reality right now, trying to counterbalance all of the consciousness progressive stuff that's coming in right now. So they're there. And the more you attune to that truth, the more you will be able to receive them and use that to keep going on your journey, even when things get really rough or nasty. So talking a little bit more about intervention, sometimes, and I'd say that this is probably the case, or probably so in a lot of the cases where individuals are turning to guides or teachers. Now, sometimes that false light, consciousness regressive entities proclaim themselves to be these things, angels or guides or whatever. But I would say the vast majority of people that turn to guides and so forth, what they're actually doing, rather than a higher density consciousness progressive being, they're tuning into aspects of themselves that they haven't fully embodied. So a form of shadow projection. You're still looking outward to some other authority, some entity or being or energy that you think knows more than you. That's a distortion. That's an imbalance. And so really look at that. Those of you that use guides and teachers and so forth, also check to make sure that it's not one of these false light beings, a consciousness regressive being pretending to be a benevolent consciousness progressive being. But also look to that it may be core self communicating with you. And it may even be aspects of this mind-body complex that you're currently functioning through. Maybe an aspect of your heart center energies, your intuitive capacities, trying to come to conscious awareness. But because of some distortion within you, you're seeing it as something external from yourself, something outside of you. So that's just a recommendation. Do what you will. I'm not telling you to not use guides. That is your decision. That is your choice. But to those of you who are sincerely on this journey, what do you have to be afraid of in looking? And if you're afraid to look and you just reject the idea out of hand, that's an imbalance based in a distortion or 2 or 3. And I don't say that in judgment. That's just what's going on. If you refuse to look, you've got some degree of cognitive dissonance going on. Again, an observation, no judgment. All right? So, now, in terms of interventions, sometimes, because higher density beings, many of them, they're not only aware of this ongoing balancing process, they consciously participate in it. Okay? And sometimes that might mean that consciousness progressive entities, beings, interact with consciousness regressive entities and beings. When they feel that something that they agree upon has the potential, they're willing to risk maybe certain things to advance to fulfill their either consciousness progressive or consciousness regressive purpose in that version of themselves. And what I mean by this, now remember, these beings are aware and they're consciously participating in the balancing process. This is the example that I'm giving. So, and they're very aware, and they're able to see what, when they tune in, they can see what others are doing, what steps others are doing on their journeys. These higher density beings, they're aware. They know how to tune in to and see what's going on, not just within themselves, but in others, and what actions have been taken. I mean, they have capacities. They're operating through capacities that we once had that most people can't even fathom. But open your mind, open your awareness, open, and consider. So they're actively seeking to fulfill their progressive, regressive purpose in this version of themselves, okay? And so it might be that there's an individual or a group of people, human beings, that let's keep it focused on one person for the moment. One individual human being who core self intends for that version of itself in this lifetime at this time to be on a consciousness progressive journey of awakening. That's their purpose. They're here to bring balance back into our reality, okay? But they're really bogged down. They're really, really blocked. For example, they've had some experiences, and to some extent, they know that what they've been told, what they're functioning through, something is off. Or it might even be a little bit more advanced than that. Perhaps they've dabbled in or actually made some progress. They have had some understanding that they're on this journey. But for whatever reason, they're bogged down now. And higher order being or beings, higher density, has been trying to get their attention through interventions, but this individual is just not picking up. Or even when they do pick up on them, they might go wow for a moment, but then they immediately or very soon thereafter push it back. They're not thinking about it. They're just drawn back in to the whatever challenging circumstances they're bogged down by right now. Okay? So, the consciousness progressive beings that may be paying attention to this individual and their progress could well turn to. They see how consciousness regressive being or beings have been interfering. Maybe not from, not from an entity appearance or presence manner, but through other people, through this individual themselves. Messing with thoughts, feelings, emotions, all of that. So the consciousness progressive entity might actually approach the consciousness regressive entity with a proposal, if you will. In other words, they put their heads together and decide on some course of action, an interference that the consciousness regressive entity would agree to. Because the consciousness progressive entity knows that perhaps the best hope of getting this individual on or back on this path might be, oftentimes this is the case with humans, where it takes something really big happening in our lives to get our attention. I mean, how many times have we heard those stories? They're countless. Where, I mean, it's only the result of huge personal suffering that people tend to really experience a big turnaround in their lives. And so knowing this, the consciousness progressive entity is willing to strike some kind of a bargain with the consciousness regressive being, because with regressive being, because the progressive entity does not interfere in that way. They do not take these kinds of actions. But in this circumstance, this is a really, let's say it's a really powerful version of core self that is meant for really important work along the path or along the lines of this consciousness progressive balancing. And so the entity may be willing to strike a bargain with the consciousness regressive entity, wherein a certain kind of interference occurs. Okay? And the consciousness regressive entity is more than willing to do this, simply because they also know, excuse me, and therefore tend to seek out people that are on this journey, people that are awakening to capacities and knowings and understandings and aligning with core self. And that's why they come at us. Balance, balance, balance. They're trying to fulfill their mission of consciousness regressive creation. That's their mission here. And ours is the opposite. So they come at us because that's the way they function. That's the way consciousness regressive, not always, but that's the way a lot of them function. Even though the foundational principle or a rule of engagement is do no harm, like I said, they work around or they don't care. So they're willing to do this act. They're willing to risk the fact that this particular kind of interference might awaken the individual or reawaken them. They're willing to take that risk because from their perspective, gee, all of their interference has really been working. So it's like, it's not much of a risk. Yeah, I'll do that. I'll set this up. And the consciousness progressive entity, really higher density, higher order, and they feel like this perhaps maybe is a, I'm not going to say last resort, but things are getting dimmer and dimmer for this version of a core self that was meant for certain things in this lifetime. And they're getting farther and farther and farther, perhaps to the point of no return, off track. So this higher density, benevolent consciousness regressive entity strikes its bargain, knowing that they risk also that this may be the one thing that totally takes the person off track. But at this point on this individual's journey, and it is through wisdom that these decisions are made. These kind of decisions on occasion to specifically consciously work with a consciousness regressive entity. So both entities are taking a risk. As part of the balancing process. Because remember, they're consciously working with their knowledge of the balancing process, and they have their missions to fulfill. The consciousness progressive entity wants you to fulfill your purpose of creating through consciousness, progressive consciousness in this reality at this time. They're behind you. That's why you get the little interventions, the little synchronicities, or the powerful dream. All of that. Because not only are you going to be fulfilling your role, your purpose, but you're helping them fulfill theirs. So everything is in harmony. So there's some interesting things that can happen. And there are far more interventions and types of interference than we can, at least in this lifetime, this version of ourselves, begin to see or understand than those that we can sort of get a handle on. But that's just one example of how an interference is really a gamble that it's going to be a big intervention. Because big interventions taken by consciousness progressive beings, these higher density beings, they're pretty rare because it's a gamble. It's a fine line on a big intervention. It's a fine line between intervention and interference. In other words, but they do happen where many a person has reported after or during the course of some horrible traumatic event, perhaps some car accident, where this individual is stuck in some ice or snow-covered gully off the side of the road. No one sees them. No one knows they're there. And they manage to come through it somehow or another. Many of those people have reported the presence of some higher order being, some higher density being, an angel or some type of entity that either made its presence known to them visually and or experientially, or implanted or pulled up from within them, tweaked. In the same way that the interferers do, they hook onto distortions, whereas the higher density being hooked into inner knowing, deeper understanding of what you really are, and your intuitive, deep inner knowing and connection with core self. They tweaked that. They hooked into that and amplified it. Those things happen. May have happened to you. But all part of the balancing. Now, as far as to consciousness regressive interference, I've talked about that. Talked about 5 different types of entity and energetic interference in a prior commentary, and I'll put a link to that below. But when you are in a place where you have so deeply you've begun to deeply embody the understanding, the awareness, ever-increasing awareness of this balancing process and how it's unfolding around you, you're becoming more and more in tune with that. then even on those occasions where you are still being interfered with, then you have less and less fear for them to hook into, first of all, and it keeps you clearer on appropriate consciousness progressive response to the situation. And remember, consciousness progressive response doesn't just mean love and light. It's about being so in tune with that moment, with what you really are, what's really going on around you, and addressing that so lucidly, or you actually slip into the fourth level of knowledge. You know, but you don't know that you know. You just respond. And the situation is dealt with, however that unfolds. But when you're at that fourth level of knowledge, there is no thought. Like, you just are. You just respond in accordance with core self desire for you in this version of itself, in this reality at this time. And if you're on this conscious journey of awakening, then that's a consciousness progressive response. However, or whatever it looks like. We can't know exactly how. Now, in the beginning stages, for example, if you are experiencing energy interference, then it's okay to experiment with different responses consciously. That's how you get in the flow. And then you get more of a sense within each situation or each occurrence, the appropriate response for that particular situation. Once you get in the flow and you start getting a sense of your own power, your own capacity to deal with this, like, this is just another being. This is part of the balancing process. Okay, in this particular instance, this time it's about get the hell out. I'm tired. I don't feel like being messed with. Whereas another time, you are so instantly filled with core self energies and capacities. And you're at peace and you're smiling, and the entity can't deal with that at all. So they just crawl away. Either response, when it's coming and aligned with core self, is a consciousness progressive response in those situations. Again, consciousness progressive response doesn't equate to rolling over. Sometimes it's appropriate to step away, remove yourself, to end a relationship. There are times when that is the consciousness progressive thing to do. And it may not be at all what ego wants to do. But sometimes it's about removal, removing yourself, or telling the other person to remove him or herself from your life. That can be very much aligned with the consciousness progressive choice of response. To just determine that it is not in the best interest, that it's interfering with your journey to fulfill your purpose. that you're so miserable that you can't think around this person. You can't be yourself around this person, whatever's going on. Perhaps it's abusive, an abusive connection with a beloved family member that has gone on for years and years and years until you finally figure out you own yourself and your purpose in this work. And you clear a distortion around what family or this particular role of parent-child or sibling is supposed to mean, and you come into your own and you finally say, that's just all a load of crap. I get to determine how I define what relationship, what these roles should mean from a consciousness progressive standpoint as someone who's on a conscious journey of awakening. But sometimes it takes us years to get to that point because of all of the societal conditioning and engineering, self-genetic manipulation around these, or attached to, they're concepts, they're false beliefs, they're distortions. But so the consciousness progressive thing to do is to get out of that relationship. And I've been through a lot of this in my own life. And if you're struggling with that, with family issues that are extreme like that, or extreme then calm, and that's how you keep justifying continuing the relationship, and you're really at odds about this and need help, I can help you. But never keep subjecting yourself to any relationship, family or otherwise, where there is abuse on an ongoing basis. That's an extreme imbalance. That goes against multiple principles of creation and rules of engagement. Do no harm means do no harm to yourself as well. It's not just about the other person. Go back to the video if you're struggling with that. The real love, real self-love and compassion video. And maybe you're ready to learn about blind compassion. Maybe you're caught up in that. Okay? But the more we know, the more we can understand about what's really going on, not this false representation of reality, this reality, for the most part now, because it is predominantly consciousness regressive, there are plenty of seeds of truth everywhere, but you really have to look, because we're in this cycle now, even though it's coming to an end. But if you're really looking, you can find them. But right now, it's so consciousness regressive oriented that many of the distortions that we hold within us, that we carry around, are so... The distortions are extremely distorted. Very extreme distortions. They're so far away from truth that, and this isn't even necessarily always about regressive consciousness, but there are just underlying truths and principles in our reality. Even if we can't see all of the facets of that yet, there are fundamental truths. And this balancing process is a fundamental truth, whether or not you believe it. It's happening, baby. It's there, and it's consciously unfolding, consciously working. It's without fail. Even in consciousness, progressive evolutionary cycles. Remember, getting back to another principle of creation, the pendulum swings. The very fact, the truth, that our evolutionary cycle that we're in right now is so consciousness regressive oriented, it's the best indicator of the heights of consciousness progression that we have already experienced and can return to again, even if not in this particular reality, on this particular timeline, but consciousness progression, consciousness regression are perfect reflections of the heights to which we can get and the depths to which we can sink, so to speak, in terms of what we're doing, what we're up to in any given time, in any reality or whatever. Put another way, this is another thing that, like I said, this is the ultimate shadow work, is to understand that we have been at the depths and the heights, the depths of consciousness, regressive consciousness, and the pinnacle of consciousness, progressive consciousness, in all these different versions of ourselves. We've been angels and boogeymen. we are, have been, will be, all of that and everything in between. Differing degrees of consciousness, progressive consciousness and consciousness regressive. And remember, I'm talking about degrees of predominant consciousness. For example, in one version of yourself, you may have been some being, let's just say for fun, a reptilian, a Syrian, whatever. But an entity that was more, that operated kind of equally through both. Maybe you had, throughout the course of your life, or maybe in another version of yourself, the early years of your life, or the first kind of half of your life, you operated through more consciousness, progressive consciousness. And then something in your life, something happened, either some event that drew you to a more consciousness, progressive state of consciousness for some time to come, or you had some, with all the tampering that's gone on, perhaps you had a recessive gene, and some event or some entity triggered that to suit their consciousness regressive role in the balancing process, and they're using you to help them do that. So owning that is, talk about taking, this is about, this journey of awakening, if about nothing else, is about full self-responsibility. And that means responsibility for all versions of yourself. It's like, okay, who am I to judge or rate or rank or devalue this other person or entity, definitively consciousness regressive, at least in that moment? Who am I to judge that, to condemn that? Now, it's your responsibility also to stand up for yourself if you were being attacked in any way, emotionally, whatever. And sometimes standing up for yourself means nothing more than filling yourself. All your energy centers are aligned. You're filled. Everything's in harmony. And oftentimes, you don't have to say a word. But other times you might need to. Again, you're so attuned to the situation, you just respond. So it's never about taking any form of abuse. Even in your real love of this other. Because remember, real love is the highest order, deepest, the utter acceptance of other. And the more we understand that other is fulfilling a mission, whether consciously or non-consciously, in this balancing process from one moment to the next, where is the need for hate? Hate, revenge. It's okay to feel anger. It's not about repressing anger, but channeling it, transmuting it, is really only possible through deep understanding. And the less emotion, and this isn't about suppression. I've got an article on my website and another video about how to start the proper way to become master of your thoughts and emotions. So it's not about suppression. Check those sources out. But the more we become masters of thoughts and emotions, the less they arise in us anyway. When we get to this place of more of just an ongoing sense of inner peace. Yeah, we might have little flare-ups of emotions. Maybe a big flare-up every now and then. But it's more to this place of, drumroll, equilibrium. Because we are in balance. When we feel these deep feelings of inner peace, it's because we are in balance. At least in that moment. We're in tune with and fulfilling our purpose. And this inner peace fills us. Equilibrium, balance. So the more we're in that state, the less likely emotions come up anyway, because when you are acting through an emotion, when that emotion is taken over you, you have not mastered it in that moment, and it takes you over. That's clouding your judgment. It clouds your ability. It limits your ability to align with core self and inner knowing as to how to respond in that moment. This is why it's so important to master, to become the master of all of your energy, thought, emotion, your behavioral energies, your sexual energies, all of that. Clarity, lucidity, allowing you the true option of making the most consciousness progressive choices of response to whatever's happening around you. Okay, so in summary, I'd say the most important things that I hope that you take away from these two commentaries about the balancing process. First of all, that the more you come into awareness and begin deeply exploring yourself, looking at your own life and circumstances, coming more and more to understand this process in terms of inner knowing, and it becomes a second nature to you to begin viewing everything that's happening in your life from this perspective. That's part of the way you're seeing things now. So that's one thing that would be excellent to take away from this. Another thing would be that it helps you minimize and begin and continue eliminating fear around whatever challenges, not just interference challenges, but whatever challenges come up in any area of your life. And not allowing fear to cloud, or other emotions, anger, or being, rage, or whatever extreme emotion that cloud your ability, because they're distortions, they're imbalances. They impair your ability to be aligned with your own inner knowing, your own higher order understandings and knowledge and awareness of what you really are, what you're really capable of in that moment. And to stay aligned with, when the less fear interferes, the more easily it is to be a full transducer of core self-desire for you. Fulfilling your consciousness progressive creation assignment in this reality at this time. All right. I'm going to call it a wrap on that. In the upcoming commentary, I'm thinking I will dig a little more into finally get into the conscious journey of awakening and relationships a little more deeply. I've been touching on them all throughout all these commentaries on some level, because this work necessitates a holistic perspective. All of these different topics seem to flow in and out and between all the different specific topics that I'm addressing in any commentary. But I think I will focus in on that. And like I said, if not, it'll be something else. Anyway, until we meet again, safe travels on your journey. Take care. Bye for now.